When we picture a medieval king, we imagine a man strictly focused on statecraft, a regal, divinely appointed ruler holding the fate of a nation in his highly disciplined hands. The reality of absolute power was much messier. Giving a single person unchecked authority across Europe usually resulted in a complete lack of boundaries, crippling paranoia, and royal courts that operated more like a chaotic reality show than a functioning government. Take King John of England. He routinely abused his authority to alienate his closest allies, kidnapping the wives of powerful nobles and charging double taxes to the very husbands he was publicly humiliating. His personal chaos became so intolerable that it directly sparked a rebellion. The barons finally cornered him and put into writing the Magna Carta, a literal legal cage designed specifically to restrict his erratic behavior. Over in France, Charles VI offered a different kind of disaster. He descended into severe mental illness, eventually developing a highly specific and paralyzing delusion that his entire body was made of fragile glass. The French state largely ceased to function because the entire court had to bend to this paranoia. Government efficiency ground to a halt as advisors spent their time literally wrapping their monarch in pillows to keep him from shattering. Then there's Henry VIII. He bankrupted his country and dismantled England's entire religious infrastructure, creating a brand new church from scratch, all to secure a divorce and manage his disastrous dating life. The men supposedly chosen by God to lead their nations frequently acted as their empire's greatest liabilities. They squandered massive state power and endless treasuries on personal obsessions and hormonal whims. While European kings were wallowing in their own drama, the real engines of power were operating quietly on the fringes. The most effective organizations of the era relied on extreme discipline, entirely avoiding the messiness of a royal court. The Knights Templar embodied this perfectly. They operated on a paradoxical fusion, combining strict monastic vows of absolute poverty with the fanatical training of an elite military force. Their discipline allowed them to solve the logistical nightmare of funding the Crusades. They invented an early international banking system where a nobleman could deposit a chest of gold in Paris, receive a coded letter, and withdraw that exact amount in Jerusalem. Those fees and deposits aggregated quickly. Soon, the Templars were the primary creditors for the kings who theoretically ruled over them. That success set up a catastrophic collision. King Philip IV found himself drowning in debt from his own financial mismanagement. To erase what he owed, he weaponized his state authority, falsely accusing, torturing, and completely disbanding the Templar Order in 1307. The Templars built an immensely powerful institution through strict discipline. They failed because they assumed the rules applied to everyone, entirely miscalculating the destructive envy of a desperate, broke monarch. To find someone who actually mastered both discipline and survival, we have to look to the South China Sea in the early 19th century. Zheng Yi started her life working on a floating Cantonese brothel. Within a decade, she rose to become the absolute commander of a 70,000-strong pirate confederation, a force that easily dwarfed the major navies of Europe. She maintained absolute control over this massive fleet through a brutal, non-negotiable set of rules known as her pirate code. If you stole from the communal treasury or assaulted a captive, the punishment was immediate beheading. This iron-fisted structure created a tactical machine. While the Qing dynasty's imperial naval forces struggled with corruption and poor organization, Zheng Yi's disciplined fleet repeatedly humiliated them, trapping heavier warships and outmaneuvering every military coalition sent her way. But her ultimate strategic masterstroke was knowing exactly when to quit. Leveraging her undefeated status, she approached the exhausted Qing government and negotiated a peaceful surrender, securing enormous wealth and official military ranks for her crew. Zheng Yi succeeded exactly where kings and Templars failed. She built her empire on ironclad rules, but relied on pragmatic negotiation rather than sheer ego, guaranteeing her permanent survival and freedom. These stories reveal a harsh truth about human empires. Flesh and blood power, whether chaotic or highly disciplined, eventually ends up in the grave. The ultimate antithesis to human chaos is Notre Dame Cathedral. This was a multi-generational project raised by nameless masons, all dedicating their sweat and engineering to a single, lasting architectural vision. That stone vision withstood centuries of the state's violent swings. revolutionaries desecrated its altars and decapitated its statues, and decades of neglect left it crumbling, yet the structure itself endured the political madness. The ultimate test came during the 2019 fire. The flames completely incinerated the cathedral's medieval wooden roof, but the massive stone structure, the very core of the original builder's vision, held firm against the collapse. The personal obsessions and petty drama of absolute rulers leave practically nothing but dust. The disciplined ambition to build something larger than yourself, whether it's a rigid code of laws, an international financial network, or a soaring cathedral of stone, remains the only true way to achieve immortality.
The medieval world was loud, violent, and viscerally unpredictable. A single bad harvest could starve a village. A sudden plague could empty a city. A petty blood feud could leave a family decimated in the mud, while embers rained down on their homes. When an individual is entirely at the mercy of disease, economic ruin, and sudden violence, the central question of life is blunt. How do you survive? Survival required more than endurance. It required a strategy to organize that chaos into something predictable. From the gutters of Europe to the laboratories of ancient Persia, to the blood-soaked thrones of Kievan Rus, history was forged by individuals who took a random, terrifying world and wrote their own rules over it. A medieval sex worker operated in absolute squalor. Her daily reality involved leaking timber roofs, rats chewing on her straw mattress, and the acidic stench of rotting flesh drifting from the neighboring tannery. She navigated this environment through rigid adherence to city law. Ordinances required her to wear a faded red gown, a mandated uniform that announced she was both legally available and taxable. Every resource was tracked with precision. She noted every short-changed penny in a mental ledger and hoarded stale crusts of bread in her sleeve to ensure she wouldn't starve if a client failed to show. Her psychological armor was equally calculated. Delivering flattery to a hostile baker or a drunken guard required the ability to dissociate on command. It was a marketable skill used to extract currency. By regimenting her hours and her income, she carved out a predictable existence where the world offered none. Thousands of miles away, the ancient Persian world offered a different approach to sensory chaos. Their marketplaces were saturated with highly curated, expensive fragrances. Persians viewed scent as a spiritual tool. A beautiful aroma was believed to influence the soul, calm the nerves, and draw the attention of the divine. Polymaths like Avicenna took the wild raw materials of the natural world and engineered early steam distillation. Using heat and condensation, they extracted the precise chemical essence of a plant into a potent liquid form. The Damascus rose fueled this scientific shift. Harvesting petals at dawn and moving them into copper stills turned a fleeting bloom into a stable, tradable commodity. These bottled extracts became a language of power. Persian ambassadors presented foreign courts with vials of rare scents to project sophistication and political dominance. Through chemistry, these artisans turned the volatile life cycle of a flower into a permanent, portable tool of prestige. On a geopolitical scale, early Kievan Rus was a landscape of fragmented tribal loyalties, blood feuds, and volatile pagan gods. When Princess Olga's husband was executed by a rival tribe, she faced a power vacuum. She responded with systematic vengeance, using it as a starting point for political reform. After burning a rebellious city to the ground, she replaced unpredictable tribal raids with a centralized tax system. Fixed collection points ensured the state functioned on bureaucracy rather than just intimidation. Her grandson, Prince Vladimir, recognized that paganism was too decentralized to support a growing empire. He needed a spiritual identity that would grant him international legitimacy. He found his solution in Byzantine orthodoxy. Its architecture and rigid hierarchy offered a tool to unify diverse tribes under a single divine authority. Vladimir enforced this transition by ordering the entire population of Kiev into the Dnieper River for a mass baptism. He rapidly overwrote tribal identity with an imperial Christian one. These systems replaced tribal instability with a framework of religion and law that would outlast the rulers who built it. Counting copper coins in a brothel, distilling rosewater in a laboratory, and ordering a mass baptism in a river appear disconnected. Yet each of these individuals identified a chaotic variable, income, nature, or tribal loyalty, and wrapped it in a framework of predictable rules. They were active architects of their own survival, constructing the rigid systems necessary to function in a world of constant threat. History is defined by these structures: the tax codes, the distilled essences, and the religious identities that survived long after the original chaos subsided.
We pay for tickets to relax, to laugh at a comedian, or watch a tragedy unfold. But in antiquity, parting those curtains offered no such escape. You were stepping directly into the crosshairs of power. Charting the visibility of truth against survival in early empires reveals a brutal pattern. Direct honesty meant a fatal drop-off in survival. But performance disrupts this. Comedy and stagecraft allowed individuals to display dangerous truths, creating a space to be heard safely. The floppy hat of the fool, the carved mask of the actor, and the stance of the fighter all served a common purpose. These disguises allowed the powerless to navigate a world that otherwise offered no voice. Look past the bells and the floppy hat to see the medieval jester for what he truly was, an emotionally captive informant. These men lived in the shadow of the gallows, sleeping near castle kitchens and eating leftovers, summoned at any hour to fix a monarch's mood or face a whipping for bad timing. Yet, in a room where diplomats flattered and courtiers lied, the fool held a specific privilege. They were the court's sanctioned critics. Jesters used absurdity and riddles to point out a king's military failures or a bishop's greed, wrapping public dissent in delicate wordplay that no one else dared to speak. This was a profession of razor-thin margins. If the queen laughed at a joke about a rival baron on Monday, the jester was safe. If she laughed a little too hard on Wednesday and the king looked annoyed, that punchline became treason. One misstep and the same crowd that cheered the wit would watch the fool hang. When human actors couldn't risk the wrath of an emperor, they transferred that risk to inanimate objects. In Indonesian wayang kulit, a single master manipulated shadow puppets to portray grand epics. Through these silhouettes, performers could safely mock royalty and voice the frustrations of the masses. After all, you cannot execute a piece of leather. These traditions functioned as mechanisms for dissent. They provided a space where rebellion could be masked as absurdity, proving that when direct speech was fatal, humor became the primary method for speaking back to power. Theater emerged from a similar need for expression. In ancient Athens, drama grew out of the chaotic festivals honoring Dionysus. Those wild, chanting rituals were eventually harnessed into structured performances in massive stone amphitheaters, creating a dedicated public space to interrogate the state of the city. The Greeks used that space as a weapon. Comedies were ruthlessly political. Playwrights like Aristophanes used the stage to openly mock warmongers, corrupt politicians, and prominent thinkers like Socrates, insulting them before thousands of cheering citizens. Globally, the stage adapted to process the local culture's pressures. India's Natya Shastra guided actors toward spiritual harmony and emotional balance. In Japan, the slow movements of No theater used haunting masks to meditate on the ghosts of dead warriors, offering a restrained introspection that allowed the audience to process memory and loss. Through loud satire or silent masks, the stage became the masses' most effective tool. It allowed people to collectively process the whims of their rulers, the cruelty of their gods, and the weight of their own history without facing retribution. Sometimes, survival required abandoning the stage for the battlefield. Ancient Macedon was a military machine defined by a towering legacy of male conquest, a world where political power was synonymous with martial skill. Royal women here were often traded as diplomatic currency, traded in marriage to secure alliances. Senine, the half-sister of Alexander the Great, rejected that role. She traded silk for steel, immersing herself in weapon training and the tactical studies of the Macedonian generals. She stepped into the male domain, donning armor and leading troops in battle against Illyrian warriors. By physically performing the duties of a general, Senine earned a reputation that wasn't tied to a husband or a father. She carved out a sphere of influence through her own demonstrated capability. Her daughter, Eurydice, took this performance to the throne. During the bloody wars for Alexander's empire, Eurydice appeared in full military dress to address the veteran armies. She spoke to the soldiers as their commander, leveraging the visual authority of a warrior to claim her right to lead. For women in patriarchal empires, adopting the physical discipline of a soldier was often the only way to shatter a monopoly on power. They used the performance of authority to claim what the system otherwise denied them. These same dynamics of performance and survival converged in the world of martial arts. In the silence of monasteries and temples, the raw violence of the battlefield was refined into sacred, codified forms that prioritized precision over brutality. This discipline prioritized internal focus over external strikes. Monks and warriors realized that to conquer an enemy, a person first had to master the difficult task of conquering their own ego, panic, and fear. Because these skills threatened ruling authorities, many deadly arts were disguised. Combat training was hidden within rhythmic dances, spiritual rituals, and regional sports like Senegalese lamb wrestling. This allowed communities to preserve their warrior traditions right in front of the regimes that tried to ban them. These hidden systems established physical self-mastery as a form of personal autonomy. They transformed the human body itself into a political statement, proving that even a person without a weapon can still be a threat. The captive jester, the masked actor, the armored queen, and the disciplined monk all shared the same survival strategy. They each found a way to use performance to navigate the dangers of their own era. That strategy came at a staggering personal cost. These performers sacrificed their dignity, their safety, and frequently their lives to carve out a small space of agency in systems that demanded their total submission. They performed to serve as a constant reminder to the elite. Beneath the bells and the makeup, the message was clear. Absolute power is fragile, and the people you rule are never truly silenced. The next time you watch a comedian roast a politician, a stage play tackle a heavy trauma, or two martial artists bow before a bout, you are seeing these ancient survival strategies in action. This is the modern face of humanity's oldest and most dangerous weapon. When we picture the past, our minds tend to project a blockbuster movie. We imagine stoic kings, flawless queens, and knights in pristine, gleaming armor, all charging heroically into battle. But that curated highlight reel leaves out the people who actually lived through these eras, the ones who had to deal with the mud, the endless walking, and the terrifying realities of the day-to-day. To truly understand history, we have to strip away the romance. We need to look at the physical toll it took to build empires, wage holy wars, and even just get dressed in the morning. Because when we look past the legendary names and the grand dates on a timeline, the raw, sensory struggle of ordinary human survival makes the past far more compelling. Take the Crusades. If you listened to the papal sermons of the Middle Ages, you'd expect a glorious, divinely sanctioned march for salvation, packed with highly disciplined warriors. The reality for the average peasant who signed up was a logistical nightmare. You marched thousands of miles with zero military training, relying on moldy supply lines led by squabbling commanders. And if you were expecting shining steel plates, you were out of luck. You'd likely be handed a rusted, hand-me-down iron sweater of chainmail. It offered exactly zero padding and dug into your shoulders with every step you took. Combat itself was utter chaos. You spent far less time in heroic cavalry charges and far more time waiting outside brick walls in the freezing rain. During these drawn-out sieges, you were much more likely to die from starvation, dysentery, or your own army's friendly fire than from an enemy sword. Surviving a crusade meant first and foremost surviving the catastrophic mismanagement of your own side. We see a similar disconnect when we look at ancient martial arts. Pop culture trains us to view these as mystical, elegant, perfectly choreographed dances. But look at the walls of this Middle Kingdom tomb in Egypt. Over 4,000 years ago, fighters were already perfecting a massive manual of grappling holds, hip tosses, and single-leg takedowns. This is the oldest documented martial art, and it was a highly developed system of physical dominance. Across the globe, martial disciplines were forged out of brutal necessity. Monks didn't just meditate, they spent grueling hours conditioning their limbs against trees and mastering rigid strikes to protect their temples from invading armies. The samurai, often pictured as effortless poets of the blade, endured intense, lifelong physical conditioning. They had to move, grapple, and fight while wearing layers of lacquer, iron, and silk, mastering multiple weapons just to survive the chaos of feudal warfare. These global combat systems were desperate, highly evolved sciences. They existed for one reason: to keep human beings alive in an incredibly violent world. You might think that at least the wealthy elites had it easy, enjoying lives of effortless, natural, glowing elegance. But ancient beauty routines were incredibly strict, highly uncomfortable, and sometimes fatal physical obligations, tied directly to social standing and religious rituals. Grooming in the harsh desert climates of antiquity required serious equipment. Elites relied on heavy stone jars filled with pungent animal fats and beeswax, smearing themselves with thick pastes just to protect their skin from blistering. In Greece and Rome, the pursuit of status took a lethal turn. Women deliberately painted their faces with toxic white lead. The goal was to prove they were wealthy enough to stay out of the sun, even as the heavy metals slowly poisoned their bloodstreams. Looking divine in the ancient world required enduring immense physical discomfort. If you wanted to project societal power, you literally had to suffer for it. That same prioritization of survival over comfort scales all the way up to the greatest empires. We remember the Byzantines for their sun-drenched surface architecture, like the towering, majestic domes of the Hagia Sophia. But the grit required to keep that empire alive is buried underground. Beneath the streets of Istanbul lies the Basilica Cistern, a massive, dark, echoing water tank built entirely for pure survival. Constantinople was surrounded by enemies and faced constant sieges. If invaders cut the aqueducts, this subterranean lifeline held enough water to keep tens of thousands of citizens from dying of thirst. The builders didn't have time to quarry fresh, matching marble. They hastily dragged in recycled ruins, mismatched columns, and raw stone from older temples. Function took absolute priority over pristine beauty. You can see that utilitarian mindset in the darkest corners of the water. They took a masterpiece of Roman carving, a massive Medusa head, turned it sideways, and shoved it into the mud just to prop up a column. True imperial resilience relied on the damp, utilitarian infrastructure hidden in the dark, far more than the gold and marble gleaming above ground. Whether you were an itchy crusader marching in rusted chainmail, a gladiator training in the blood-soaked sand, an aristocrat painting your face with lead, or a Byzantine citizen drinking from a dark cistern, life was an exercise in extreme physical endurance. Stripping away the romanticized myths doesn't ruin the story of the past. It removes the polished veneer and leaves us with something much more relatable and deeply human. History is best understood through the daily, gritty struggle of everyday people, waking up each morning and trying their absolute best to survive.
When a society faces a sudden crisis, whether from an invisible pathogen, a collapsing economy, or an invading army, panic is rarely the final response. Humans do something highly specific when the world falls apart. We build walls. Stone and mortar keep the outside out, but we rely just as much on psychological barricades, the rigid systems and strict rules we use to force order onto chaos. From the plague-ridden streets of the 14th century to the underground speakeasies of the 1920s, the history of human survival is defined by these extreme behavioral codes. We construct these systems to save ourselves, but the line separating a code that protects a society from one that destroys it is dangerously thin. In 1348, medieval cities were overpopulated, lacked basic sanitation, and provided an open buffet for plague-carrying fleas. An urban center was a death trap, where simple human proximity guaranteed infection. Medical practitioners tried to impose physical barriers against this threat. They created early versions of PPE, stuffing bird-beaked masks with aromatic herbs to ward off the foul air they believed carried the disease. The true survival code was behavioral. Those who lived didn't fight the disease. They practiced isolation. They fled to high elevations, abandoned the markets, and severed contact with the outside world, adopting the silence and solitude of cloistered monks.
To survive the biological chaos of the Black Death, humanity's most effective weapon was to suppress its inherent social nature. Interacting with neighbors meant death, so survivors shut their doors and smothered the very social instincts that define us. War presents a different kind of existential crisis. It is psychologically impossible to convince a rational human being to willingly march into brutal, hand-to-hand combat. To overcome this, ancient societies had to hack human psychology. Sparta built its civilization around total obedience to the collective. Individualism was punished, and boys were raised in state-run military programs to act as interchangeable components of a violent machine. You held the shield to protect the man next to you, and breaking formation was a moral collapse. Centuries later, the Japanese samurai adhered to Bushido. This code demanded the death of the individual ego, binding a warrior to his feudal lord with an obligation tighter than any contract. Loyalty was absolute, and if a samurai failed his master, the only way to reclaim dignity was ritual suicide. The Norse used mythology to enforce their own martial order. The Viking warrior code weaponized the afterlife, promising the paradise of Valhalla only to those who died violently in battle. A peaceful death in bed was a spiritual failure. Combat became a religious necessity. These military systems successfully defended territories and expanded empires. They did so by systematically programming the death of individual identity, proving that humans will sacrifice themselves if the rules demand it. For most of history, the unpredictable nature of the human mind terrified society. Ancient cultures blamed erratic behavior on wandering spirits or demonic possession, relying on exorcisms and rituals to bring the disturbed back into alignment. By the Enlightenment, the strategy shifted from spiritual cleansing to physical containment. Governments constructed massive, prison-like asylums, warehousing the mentally ill far from city centers. They enforced rigid discipline, subjecting inmates to strict routines under the belief that madness was a moral failing that could be corrected through compliance. This obsession with control reached a peak in the mid-20th century. Psychiatrists, desperate for a physical fix to a psychological problem, turned to extreme invasive procedures. Through practices like the ice pick lobotomy, doctors used crude, violent tools to physically sever brain connections, reducing patients to a docile, manageable state. Lacking the medical understanding to actually cure the mind, society opted to violently subjugate the body. The goal was rarely healing, it was maintaining the illusion of order. By the late 1800s, America faced a crisis of substance abuse. Saloons dominated civic life, and rampant alcohol consumption drove poverty, domestic violence, and social decay. The federal government responded with the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. This was a blunt force attempt to legislate moral purity, instantly criminalizing the manufacture and sale of any beverage with an alcohol content over 0.5%. But the strict law immediately fractured against human appetite. Gangsters turned the ban into a billion-dollar business, professionalizing organized crime, and empowering figures like Al Capone to build massive syndicates that bought off judges, police, and entire city governments. The attempt to banish human appetite through a strict legal code failed. In the process, it engineered a national crisis of crime and corruption that was far more dangerous than the original social decay. Whether we are facing a microscopic flea, an invading army, a chemical imbalance in the brain, or a societal vice, humanity's default reaction is remarkably consistent. We enforce a strict code. But there is a paradox in how we apply these rules. Blunt force rigidity is effective for immediate physical crises, like quarantining a plague or holding a shield wall. When we apply that same uncompromising control to complex psychological conditions, the fix becomes a disaster. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 stands out because it is one of the rare instances where a society looked at a massive, unyielding system of control, realized the damage it caused, and finally admitted it was broken. As we face modern crises, history offers a clear warning. We survive by building systems to manage chaos, but we have to recognize the razor-thin line between the discipline that protects society and the control that ultimately breaks it. We like to imagine ancient history as a series of heroic moments. The lone, brilliant conqueror, charging into battle to claim the world with sheer bravery and a bronze sword.
We extend that same pristine myth to the concept of civilization itself. We look at the ruins of the Roman Forum and picture a society governed by orderly debates, gleaming marble institutions, and flawless laws. Fast forward a few centuries, and we imagine the Middle Ages as an era defined by quiet devotion, monks in serene cloisters, humming hymns, and living in peaceful piety. But an empire attempting to govern based on heroism, marble monuments, or prayer would collapse entirely within a single week. History's most successful societies were sustained by something far more practical. Beneath the official charters and royal decrees, they ran on a massive, ruthless, and entirely invisible operational underworld. Consider the myth of the invincible Macedonian phalanx. When Alexander left Macedon, he was managing a moving city of nearly 40,000 people. This chart shows the exponential scaling of the army's daily grain and water requirements. You start with roughly a kilogram of grain a day for one soldier. Multiply that by 40,000, add camp followers and thousands of war horses, and the totals are staggering. He survived by deploying a logistical nervous system. Scouts branched out days in advance to map wells and negotiate agricultural networks before the main column arrived. Moving that city required constant, on-the-fly engineering. When a river was too wide, they built ferries and lashed rafts together. When laying siege, they required massive amounts of timber for battering rams and towers, temporarily transforming the entire army into a synchronized construction workforce. Maintaining the human engine was equally taxing. Medics treated infections and filtered polluted water, while commanders managed morale with organized rest. Relieving psychological stress was as critical as weaponry to keep men from dissolving into open mutiny. Alexander's ultimate borders were determined by the physical breaking point of his supply chain in the Gedrosian Desert. Logistics, not the military genius of a single man, drew the final line. Rome operated on a similar duality. While the Senate held its political theater, the Suburra, a towering, deafening, and chaotic slum, housed the empire's labor force. Tens of thousands of people were crammed into insulae, cheap wooden tenements stacked 5 or 6 floors high. Landlords built them quickly to maximize rent, leaving residents to face the constant, deadly threats of building collapse and fast-moving fires. The manual labor and daily manufacturing housed within those walls kept Rome's elite fed and functioning. The Suburra provided the porters, blacksmiths, and market vendors necessary for the city to move. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and we see a similar pattern. Feudalism officially ran on rigid rules, tithes, and royal taxes. Beneath that surface, a vast shadow economy was the only system actually keeping the wheels of commerce turning. Unofficial thieves' guilds organized territories and settled disputes. Backroom moneylenders provided mutual aid when borrowing was considered a sin. And widespread smuggling rings moved salt, grain, and iron right past the tax collectors. The laws of history were written in marble and royal decrees. Daily survival, however, relied on participating directly in these resilient underground networks. The rulers at the top of these societies were acutely aware of the threats around them. Medieval monarchs employed poison tasters to navigate kitchens that doubled as biochemical hazard zones, and occasionally staged their own deaths to escape political S's. The peasants who whispered about conspiracies were observing a real phenomenon. The church ran a continent-wide intelligence network. Monks made excellent spies. They traveled freely, observed human behavior intently, and gathered local gossip disguised as holy confessions. Some monasteries also operated restricted vaults, locking away ancient pagan manuscripts and advanced scientific texts. By controlling what the public was allowed to read, they used knowledge to maintain institutional authority. While villagers believed the Knights Templar were hoarding treasure and worshipping demons, their secretive meetings focused on the mechanics of an efficient proto-modern banking cartel. They created a system where a pilgrim could deposit money in England and withdraw it in Jerusalem. Their coded ledgers and secure international vaults were so effective that they terrified perpetually broke monarchs, which triggered their eventual downfall. Underground escape routes utilized coded messages and safe houses to pull persecuted families across borders. These networks saved lives by operating entirely outside the view of official institutions. The intense paranoia of the Middle Ages was a rational response. When the systems that actually govern survival are hidden, looking for conspiracies is a survival instinct. Ancient laborers and medieval peasants accurately sensed the grinding operational machinery of the world operating just out of their sight. The official monuments, holy chants, and heroic myths of the conquerors are curated stories. They distract from the logistical and economic realities of governance. The success of any empire depends on the integrity of the invisible networks operating beneath it. If you want to understand how the world truly works, you have to look past the crowns and study the shadows.
We routinely push our bodies to the edge. From biohacking protocols to grueling tattoo sessions and intensive cosmetic surgeries, modern humans endure extreme physical modification to elevate their status or change how they feel. Today, that level of modification is often a choice. In the ancient and medieval worlds, everyday life was locked on a track. Most people were born into a rigid hierarchy, facing a lifetime of back-breaking labor and prescribed suffering. When your daily reality is an agonizing loop, a temporary distraction falls short. These societies looked for a way to bypass the physical and social boundaries of their existence entirely. Reaching that higher plane exacted a massive toll. People traded their neurological stability, destroyed their physical health, and risked their social standing, paying whatever price was required to feel something beyond the ordinary. In ancient Egypt, the physical toll of building a desert empire was relentless. To cope, they engineered their beverages, heavily lacing daily and ceremonial wine with potent psychoactive elements to alter their state of consciousness. The primary botanical catalyst was the blue lotus flower. By soaking these petals in wine and inhaling their essence, priests and elites induced a dreamy euphoria. They interpreted this chemical high as a direct communion with the gods. This chemical escapism peaked during the Feast of Drunkenness. Once a year, citizens gathered in temple courtyards to purposefully consume spiked brews until they blacked out, an extreme state-sanctioned ritual to honor the goddess Hathor. The physical backlash was severe. Participants endured crippling hangovers and literal alcohol poisoning. When ingredients like mandrake root were added, the risks escalated to night terrors and sudden cardiac arrest. Yet enduring these toxic side effects carried no stigma. For the Egyptians, surviving the brutal reality of a desert environment required touching the divine. The chemical damage was simply the accepted cost of that sacred transaction. Hundreds of years later in Renaissance Florence, the pursuit of elevation took a quieter, deadlier form. Women sought a perfectly porcelain, ethereal pallor, using cerussa, a toxic paint forged from lead and mercury. The heavy metals absorbed directly into their bloodstream, causing their skin to rot and fester with sores. As the poisoning took hold, the accepted solution was to apply thicker layers of lead to mask the decaying flesh. Below the neck, they encased themselves in rigid whalebone corsets. These structures forcefully flattened the torso and elongated the silhouette, overriding natural anatomy. Women faced immense pressure to attend lavish banquets locked inside this anatomical armor. The resulting restricted airflow meant public fainting became frequent. A sun-baked, tanned face meant you labored in the fields. To physically separate themselves from the lower classes, these noble women sacrificed their respiratory health and shortened their lifespans, transforming their bodies into untouched art. In Edo period Japan, the societal track was strictly enforced by law. The ruling shogunate instituted severe sumptuary codes, banning lower classes, like laborers, firemen, and gamblers, from wearing luxurious fabrics or displaying wealth. Stripped of outward expression, marginalized groups pushed their luxury beneath their plain clothes. They developed irizumi, massive, full-body tattoos that acted as a hidden spiritual armor. The process relied on the brutal tabori method. Artists hand-poked ink using steel needles, demanding hundreds of hours of unnumbed endurance. The pain was the point. Sitting motionless through years of stabbing punctures served as a grueling physical trial to prove resolve to their brotherhood. By weaponizing their own suffering, these societal outcasts bought an identity the shogunate could never confiscate. The pain became a permanent record of their entry into a world where the ruler's laws didn't apply. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church maintained a firm grip over intellectual and sexual thought in Europe. They used official lists of forbidden books to dictate exactly what could be read or known. Readers used scholarly loopholes to bypass censors, turning to clinical anatomy texts. The exposed bodies in surgical illustrations provided an alibi for consuming taboo imagery. These manuscripts, alongside hidden love spells, were passed hand to hand in an underground network out of sight from the Inquisition. Getting caught meant the loss of status, imprisonment, or exile. Yet thousands took that gamble. Reading a forbidden book became a calculated act to reclaim private pleasure and autonomy from an oppressive system. It is easy to look back on these practices as historical curiosities or evidence of vanity, but that overlooks the common thread connecting each era. Across centuries and continents, people have consistently made the same choice. Whether damaging their organs, poisoning their skin, or risking everything for a book, they have proven that survival is rarely enough on its own. The methods of escape will continue to change as our technology advances, but the drive to push past the limits of the physical world remains a persistent part of our history.
It is the winter of 1603. Inside the tapestried halls of Richmond Palace, the air is thick with a strange, heavy silence. Queen Elizabeth I is approaching her 70th year, yet she refuses to sleep, refuses to sit, and stubbornly refuses to name a successor. For 44 years, she had maintained her power through a meticulously cultivated image. Her subjects knew her as the Virgin Queen, a figure of ageless, divine authority, defined by a complexion as smooth and white as polished porcelain. This legendary mask was achieved through the daily application of Venetian ceruse. It was a thick cosmetic paste that promised a perfect pale finish, but its effectiveness relied on a deadly primary ingredient: white lead. Decades of lead exposure caused more than just skin-deep damage. The toxin slowly ravages the nervous system, leading to the exact symptoms witnessed in Elizabeth's final days: deep melancholy, cognitive decline, and a skeletal wasting of the body beneath her ornate gowns. For Elizabeth, this mask was a tool of statecraft, a necessary illusion to project an aura of unchanging strength. But the price of the facade was the woman herself. The same substance that sustained her public legend was the one quietly accelerating her decline, eventually leaving her dynasty to end in silence and shadows. In 1692, the village of Salem presented a face of strict Puritan devotion and orderly community life. But beneath the thatched roofs and as right of the pillory, the settlement was fractured. Years of land disputes, failed crops, and political rivalries had created a community governed more by neighborly grudges than by spiritual grace. When a group of young girls began displaying unexplained fits, the local legal system adopted a new, invisible standard of proof: spectral evidence. The court ruled that if a victim claimed to see the specter or ghost of an accused witch, that vision alone was enough to secure a conviction. This pseudo-legal facade allowed the community to weaponize their fears. They didn't target the devil, they targeted the vulnerable: homeless beggars, outspoken widows, and rival landowners. The trials provided a righteous cover to purge anyone who didn't fit the community's rigid social order. By the time the madness subsided, 19 people had been led to the gallows and hanged. All of them died maintaining their innocence, while hundreds more remained in filthy, overcrowded cells, their lives and reputations permanently shattered. The Salem courts used the mask of religious duty to justify a campaign of personal vengeance. By treating invisible claims as undeniable facts, they built a system where objective truth was discarded in favor of a useful, terrifying narrative. This painted vessel depicts the original role of cacao. To the Maya and Aztec civilizations, the bitter bean was a sacred substance, a gift from the gods used in spiritual rituals and royal ceremonies. It was a tool for divine connection, long before it became a commodity for the global market. European colonizers stripped the bean of its sacred meaning. transforming the bitter ritual drink into an aristocratic delicacy. By adding sugar, they created a fashionable luxury that the European elite used to signal their wealth and sophistication, masking the spicy indigenous roots of the plant. But this sweetness required a brutal engine of manual labor. As seen in this 19th century plantation, the cacao trade was built on the backs of enslaved people. Millions of Africans were shipped across the Atlantic to provide the forced labor necessary to harvest and process the beans, creating a system where human suffering was the hidden cost of every cup.
The Industrial Revolution further sanitized this history. Factories like this one mechanized the process, turning a blood-soaked colonial commodity into consistent, colorful bars. Mass production replaced the history of the plantation with the imagery of childhood wonder and affordable indulgence. The luxurious image of chocolate functioned as a deliberate mask, hiding the systemic exploitation and indigenous erasure required to feed a global demand. The colorful packaging didn't just sell a product, it obscured the labor and the people who made its existence possible. This log cabin with its finished porch represents the life the Cherokee Nation had built by the 1830s. They were a settled agricultural people who had adopted a written constitution, a newspaper, and a formal government in an attempt to protect their sovereignty through American legal norms. Despite these efforts to coexist, white settlers and Southern politicians viewed Cherokee territory only as an obstacle. The discovery of gold in Georgia intensified the demand to seize native lands for white settlement and resource extraction. To justify the forced removal of thousands of people, President Andrew Jackson used the rhetoric of protection. He framed the Indian Removal Act not as a land grab, but as a noble necessity for the survival of native nations, placing a benevolent mask over a policy of displacement. The Cherokee took their case to the Supreme Court and won, with the court ruling that they were a sovereign nation. However, the federal government chose to ignore the law. In 1838, the military began the forced roundup of Cherokee families, prioritizing political expansion over legal standing. The result was the Trail of Tears. Thousands died from cold, hunger, and disease as they were forced to march hundreds of miles to an unfamiliar territory. It was a calculated erasure of an established community, carried out in the name of national expansion. By framing this campaign of mass death as the inevitable march of progress, the United States government attempted to justify an act of ethnic cleansing. They transformed a violent theft of land into a necessary step in the growth of a young nation. History is filled with masks, veneers of legality, righteousness, or beauty meant to hide a darker reality. But these historical facades are rarely permanent. Eventually, the evidence of what they were meant to conceal begins to emerge. We see it in the final state of Elizabeth I, whose body could no longer sustain the image of the Virgin Queen. We see it in Salem, where the local legal system eventually buckled under the weight of its own lack of evidence, leading to public apologies and the release of the remaining prisoners. Today, indigenous communities and ethical producers are challenging the industrial narrative of the cacao trade. They are reclaiming the sacred history of the bean and forcing a confrontation with the brutal labor conditions that have been hidden behind sugar and foil for centuries. And the nations forced onto the Trail of Tears did not vanish. Despite the efforts to erase their culture and autonomy, the Cherokee, Choctaw, and others rebuilt their societies, proving that their identity was more resilient than the policies designed to end it. These stories remind us that power will often try to paint over its actions with a veneer of progress or necessity, but as these masks fail, they leave behind the reality they were meant to hide. While a facade can obscure a truth for a generation, the facts themselves remain, enduring long after the paint has worn away. Modern disaster preparation often relies on Wi-Fi cameras and basements full of freeze-dried food. But when a brutal winter hit a medieval landscape, survival was a matter of dirt, friction, and immediate ingenuity. Fire was the most vital asset, but striking sparks in a freezing rain was notoriously difficult. To solve this, travelers carried fire with them. They would take a glowing ember from their home hearth, wrap it in dried moss or fungus, and pack it into a hollowed-out animal horn. This bundle would smolder for an entire day, ready to be revived with a single breath. Defending one's property required a similar long-term strategy. Instead of cutting down timber to build fences that eventually rot, farmers planted rows of thorny trees like hawthorn or blackthorn. By bending and weaving the living branches together as they grew, they cultivated a living fence, an impenetrable, thorny wall that became stronger and denser every decade. During the most extreme famines, survival meant eating the forest itself. Peasants would shave away the tough outer bark of pine or birch trees to reach the soft, moist cambium layer underneath. This inner bark was dried, ground into powder, and baked into bark bread to provide the calories needed to endure the season. These methods show that medieval survival was far from passive. It was a process of actively engineering the natural world to force the earth to sustain life. Beyond simple tools, medieval communities understood how to manipulate temperature without electricity. They relied on the thermal mass of clay to create a primitive form of refrigeration. This diagram shows the physics of a clay-based cooling system. Because the clay is unglazed and porous, moisture slowly seeps through to the outer surface. As that water evaporates into the air, it pulls heat away from the vessel, dropping the internal temperature. Storing these pots in cellars or burying them in oxygen-poor peat bogs added another layer of protection. Bogs are naturally cold and acidic, preserving organic matter so effectively that archaeologists are still discovering edible, centuries-old butter caches hidden deep in the mud. Mastering these physical elements allowed early societies to stabilize and grow. But as civilizations became more organized, the greatest threat to survival shifted from the natural world to the social one. By the Renaissance, physical safety was a given for the elite. In this new era, survival was no longer measured in calories or warmth, but in the ability to conform to the rigid, often dangerous standards of the upper class. Status was signaled through a porcelain-white complexion, most famously modeled by Queen Elizabeth I. To achieve this look, women used Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic paste made from white lead mixed with vinegar. The physiological cost was devastating. Constant exposure to the lead caused the skin to corrode and the teeth to rot. Many women also took arsenic wafers to lighten their skin from the inside out, resulting in hair loss, muscle paralysis, and eventual death. In high society, the cost of power was often a slow, systemic poisoning. Staying relevant meant sacrificing one's own physical health to meet a social ideal. The pursuit of status through physical modification wasn't limited to Europe. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztecs viewed beauty as a permanent badge of nobility and divine favor. This ancient skull shows the results of cranial modification. From infancy, wooden boards were bound to a child's head to force the bone to grow in an elongated, sloped shape. For the Maya, this was a clear, permanent marker of high social standing. They also practiced grueling dental work, using obsidian tools to drill holes into healthy teeth. These cavities were then filled with jade or turquoise and sealed with natural resins, turning a smile into a display of religious and social devotion. Whether we are engineering the earth to find food or our own anatomy to find a place in society, these adaptations are driven by external pressures. But the most resilient engineering is required when the threat is purely internal. Mary Godwin was born in 1797 to parents whose radical writings had challenged the foundations of the English monarchy. But just 11 days after her birth, her mother, the pioneering feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, died, leaving Mary to grow up in the shadow of a woman she would only know through books. At 16, Mary eloped with the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, a move that ignited a scandal and led to a devastating period of loss. Over the next few years, Mary buried 3 of her own children, her life becoming a constant cycle of mourning and exile. The tragedy reached a climax in 1822 when Percy drowned in a storm off the coast of Italy. At only 24 years old, Mary was left widowed and emotionally shattered, with the physical evidence of her loss carved into the stone. She found herself isolated in a society that had already rejected her, surrounded by the memory of a family that had vanished. To survive, she applied the same human ingenuity that her ancestors had used to tame the wilderness. She engineered her grief into a tool for endurance. During the year without a summer in 1816, a volcanic eruption had turned the Swiss sky gray and cold.
Trapped inside this villa by the weather, Mary and her companions challenged each other to write stories that would capture the gloom of their isolation. Mary drew on the trauma of her lost children and the scientific theories of her time. She imagined a creator who succeeds in giving life, only to be horrified by the lonely, suffering creature he brings into the world. This 1818 first edition of Frankenstein was Mary's attempt to process her own solitude. By asking what happens when a creator abandons their discovery, she established the ethical and scientific questions that would provide a foundational framework for modern speculative literature. She spent the rest of her life as a professional author and editor, quietly defying Victorian expectations to secure her husband's literary legacy while forging her own path as a novelist and biographer. Human resilience is built on this ability to adapt. We use clay to preserve our food, we endure poison to preserve our status, and when everything else is lost, we use ink to preserve our souls. We build enduring monuments out of the very things that threaten to destroy us.
In 1348, the Black Death arrived as a biological vacuum, a force that simply ignored every social defense humanity had built. It was a crisis of invisible multiplication, where a rapidly mutating pathogen consumed entire populations before anyone could even define what was killing them. With no scientific shield, survival required a radical retreat from the human collective. Those who lived were often the ones who vanished, like the Carthusian monks, whose vows of near-total silence and rural isolation accidentally created the first elite quarantine bubbles. These early successes taught survivors that the only way to outlast a chaotic nature was to build rigid behavioral boundaries. They learned to equate predictability with life and social interaction with an immediate death sentence. This blueprint for survival, the suspension of liberty for the sake of safety, became the default setting for Western order. It established a precedent that would last for centuries, the belief that to prevent a return to the chaos of 1348, human nature had to be engineered, monitored, and kept under absolute control. Early civilizations applied this logic to the battlefield, attempting to tame the volatility of warfare by erasing the individual. They sought to replace the messy instinct for self-preservation with the cold, reliable mechanics of a martial code. The samurai's Bushido code made social disgrace a fate worse than physical destruction. A warrior who brought shame to his name was socially obligated to perform seppuku, a ritualized suicide intended to reclaim honor through total self-negation. In the 19th century, Shaka Zulu enforced this discipline through a total militarization of his society. Warriors were organized into age-based regiments and forbidden from marrying until they had proven their loyalty in blood. In this system, breaking formation during a charge led to immediate public execution. These codes successfully secured empires, but they did so by transforming human beings into disposable, mechanized components of a state machine. As the centuries progressed, this obsession with order turned inward. During the Victorian era, anyone who deviated from social norms was warehoused in brutal institutions. These asylums were built for isolation, serving as human broom closets where the mentally ill could be kept out of the public eye. By the mid-20th century, the pursuit of mental predictability became surgical. The ice pick lobotomy was marketed as a fast, clinical fix for agitation and nonconformity. In just minutes, a patient's personality could be permanently severed, leaving them quiet, vacant, and manageable. The system only began to crack in the 1960s, when leaders like John F. Kennedy, haunted by the surgical tragedies within their own families, pushed to replace physical confinement with community-based support and pharmaceutical management. For centuries, the medical establishment prioritized manageable bodies and social compliance over the difficult, often messy reality of true human healing. This drive for total conformity eventually reached the American dinner table. Prohibition was a massive social experiment, fueled by a belief that poverty and violence could be deleted from the human experience if the government simply outlawed a single vice. The Volstead Act gave federal agents the authority to purge the country's streets through brute force. They raided warehouses and smashed barrels in the open air, attempting to cleanse the nation's morality by destroying its physical supply of alcohol. Prohibition represented the zenith of this systemic hubris, the assumption that the state could legislate the chaos of human desire out of existence. History shows that when you build a cage, human nature eventually finds a way to break the bars. In the 1960s, the push to close asylums was a victory for civil rights, but without a replacement safety net, the results were catastrophic. Between 1960 and 2000, as state psychiatric beds were eliminated, the general prison population spiked. We didn't solve the crisis of untreated mental health. We simply moved it from the hospital into the prison system and onto the streets. Prohibition followed a similar logic of blowback. Banning alcohol created a billion-dollar vacuum that was instantly filled by criminal syndicates. Figures like Al Capone built untouchable empires, using the illegal profits to corrupt the very systems meant to enforce the law. While the law failed to create a sober nation, it accidentally triggered a cultural rebellion. The speakeasy became a space where race, gender, and class barriers dissolved, creating a haze of jazz and illicit liquor that defined an entire generation. Whenever a society attempts to enforce absolute control, it inadvertently funds and organizes an equally powerful, highly sophisticated underground resistance. The illusion of prohibition finally collapsed under the weight of the Great Depression. By the 1930s, bread lines stretched across every major city, and the government realized it could no longer afford to fund a moral crusade while its people were starving. Franklin D. Roosevelt won the presidency on a platform of repeal. By late 1933, the government officially surrendered its attempt at total moral control, choosing tax revenue and social stability over the failed pursuit of enforced purity. We cannot legislate, medicate, or codify the unpredictable parts of our nature out of existence. True societal progress isn't achieved by trying to cage the chaos, but by learning how to navigate the mess.